Welcome to Mom and Mind, a podcast about maternal mental health from conception to pregnancy and postpartum. Real stories from moms and family members who have made it from struggling to wellness, and interviews with experts and advocates who work for moms and families to get the help they need. We discuss very real struggles that can sometimes be hard to hear, but these are stories that need to be told so that moms and families can know that healing is possible. This podcast is meant to offer information and awareness and is not a replacement for treatment by a professional. Thank you for being with us today. This episode touches on topics that may be sensitive for some listeners. Welcome back to Mom and Mind. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. In this episode, we're talking with Courtney Novak about her personal experience and journey through postpartum mental health struggles. Her story and experiences like hers are so important for us to hear and understand. We need to know that these complications are very real and they happen to very real people. Also, that healing is possible and there's help available for moms who are struggling. And Courtney will share with us her experience and how she is now helping moms through her own podcast and community support group. Courtney had postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, and postpartum OCD after the birth of her daughter Peppa in 2013. As part of her recovery, she started writing a memoir, Adventures with Postpartum Depression, that would be published in early 2017. She wanted to share more than her own story, though, so she started a weekly podcast called Adventures with Postpartum Depression. She also runs a weekly peer-to-peer support group for moms who have had a maternal mood disorder. Thank you so much for being here, Courtney. I'm really glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Kat.
Yeah, no problem. You can call me Kat. So like I was saying in your intro, you've been through quite a bit and you're out of it and now helping other moms. But I think it would be really good if you feel whatever you feel comfortable with saying and wherever you want to start to tell us what happened for you and how did you come to this?
Yeah, well, I had postpartum depression, anxiety, and OCD in 2013 after my daughter was born. She was my first. I had a pretty tough pregnancy. I think it was as tough as it could be without me having to be hospitalized. And Pippa was always totally healthy and fine, but I was nauseous until the last month and had back pains, and it was just sort of a all around miserable experience. And when she was born, she had jaundice, and I immediately blamed myself, because the doctor, the pediatrician said something about, well, your milk hasn't come in, so we need to supplement with formula to help her, get the bilirubin. So I just immediately blamed myself, for the fact that my milk hadn't come in, and I really equated breastfeeding with being a good mom, and had taken, I think it's great that people are advocating for breastfeeding, and, moms should be allowed to breastfeed wherever they want, but it's sort of gone to a farther place, at least out here in Pasadena, where it's very extreme. Breast milk is liquid gold, and your IQ is going to be higher, and they'll be healthier. And since then, I've done research and found most of that's kind of just speculation. And and if the mom is not well, the baby's not well. But at the time, I really felt just awful, like a failure.
Yeah.
So it was sort of like the frog in the water, where if you start to dial up the heat, doesn't notice. And sort of my anxiety did that. And I assume this is how all moms feel. Just the thought of doing a load of laundry was really overwhelming.
Yeah.
Stuff I got really fixated on finding the best sling, and okay, if I find the best sling, life as a mom will get easy and I'll be able to leave the house. And I really struggled to get out of the house. And I knew I have to get out there, and I have to be able to go to the mall and see friends. But I just going to Target 4 minutes from my house was like a lunar expedition.
Yeah.
And, I thought if I find the right nursing wardrobe, the right sling, the right stroller, the right whatever. And, it just kept getting worse and worse in terms of being harder and harder to get out of the house. Then I had insomnia that started at 3 months postpartum. And that lasted for 5 weeks. And I really sunk into despair and felt like I'm broken, but I don't have a right to feel bad about it because I got a beautiful baby in exchange. A lot of moms who have struggled with fertility, and I felt like I don't have a right to any of these negative feelings because at least I have my baby.
Oh boy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the breastfeeding, the fertility, and I had a lot of sensory overload. Like I took Pippa to a mommy and me class, and I just felt like the teacher was blowing bubbles and they were like fireworks in my face.
Oh no.
And
Right.
then I had, dark thoughts and thought about what I wanted was for the doctors to put me in a coma until they could figure out a way to fix me. And I didn't think they ever would be able to fix me, but that was okay. But then I started having thoughts of hurting Pippa. She would be screaming, and it always happened like around noon.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be walking loops around our house to calm her. And then I'd just have a vision of throwing her as hard as I could on the floor.
Yeah.
I'd see her brain smashing out, and I'd push the thought away as quickly as possible. But I just felt like, oh my gosh, who am I that I'm having these thoughts?
Right.
And I finally, I was Googling a lot, trying to figure out what was going on, but I'd see hits for postpartum depression, and I just had it in my mind, I'm not the sort of person who gets postpartum depression. I thought this is kind of a fake illness that divas get because they miss all the attention of pregnancy, or they're lazy and they don't want to take care of their baby.
Uh-huh.
So I would never look at those Google hits. And
Yeah.
I have a history of being a little bit of a hypochondriac. I went into pregnancy as a anxious but highly functional anxious person.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I went to an Ivy League college, and being anxious was actually really good because it kept me in the library studying. And then I was a lawyer, and being anxious was good because I always got my work done, well ahead of time.
Right.
But then suddenly throw a baby in and, hormones. And I feel like my hormones, they don't do great when there's like a big interruption. Like,
Yeah.
I can't take the birth control pill. I took it for a year and a half of my life and was just crazy from it.
It made you feel terrible.
Yeah, lots of crying, jumping out of my skin,
Yeah.
edgy, and really bad periods too. And I had this old school elderly obstetrician, and when I told him my periods are worse on the pill, he's like, they shouldn't be. Like I'm doing something wrong. I'm like, do you think I'm willing this extra blood out of my body?
Right.
This is not me.
Right. That is the worst reaction from providers. It's just like, oh, well, either I've never heard of that before, or like you're the only person.
Yeah, you're making this up in your head.
Yeah, you should be fine.
Yeah. And then I actually had to take Plan B once with my husband, but back when we were dating, and I was for a whole week just like didn't feel like myself, felt wrong, felt like the world was ending, and then I snapped out of it. So in hindsight, I can see like, oh, I'm someone kind of sensitive to hormonal changes.
Right.
So yeah, 4 months postpartum, I finally went to see my obstetrician after one of my good friends. I'd emailed college friends earlier and said things are tough, but I was afraid to say how tough. And everyone responds with, well, yeah, having a newborn, it's like boot camp. It's so difficult. And I was afraid to respond back with like, yeah, but I see everyone on Instagram leaving the house and I can't. On.
At this point, did anybody around you sense anything? Was it noticeable what was going on for you?
My parents say they sensed something and they didn't know how to approach me. And I was very protective of Pippa and very just defensive. Like they would bring up breastfeeding and I would just lash out like, I am breastfeeding until she's 1 year old and then she'll self-wean. And like I had this boxes from Amazon. I kept buying things hoping they'd be the solution. And then when they weren't, I'd put the box in the living room and it was like 2.5 feet high. And my parents went out of town for a month. So like the 3rd month postpartum, they were gone. And when they came back, they saw that and they're like, they just knew like something's wrong, but they didn't know how to bring it up with my husband and me.
Well, I think that's something I think is really important to point out because so many moms, this is such an internal experience that it's like, it feels so loud and so big in your head and it's so confusing, but sometimes people just don't see anything different on the outside. Or if they do, they're like, oh, she just had a baby, and dismiss it totally.
Yeah, like, oh, she's a little sleep deprived, she'll be fine.
Right.
And people kept telling me, like, there was a breastfeeding support group and they said, oh, at the 6-week mark, it gets easier. And then they were like, oh, just kidding, really at the 3-month mark. and if you want to find answers to things, the internet will give them.
Yeah.
So I ran searches, will it get easier at 4 months? And of course I'd find posts that say life gets easier at 4 months. So I kept just trying to hang on. And probably insomnia was I'd have like 2 or 3 really bad nights of just like 3 hours. And then I'd get like 5.5 or 6 hours, and I would convince myself, oh, don't call your doctor. You're coming out of the woods. And my daughter's pediatrician told me to quit caffeine because that might be making jittery. So then I quit caffeine the same day the insomnia started.
Oh, boy.
Must have been just a horrible coincidence, but I just became convinced, like, I'm in caffeine withdrawal. I brought this upon myself by having caffeine. I just have to ride this out. Like, what am I supposed to tell my obstetrician that,
So it's just like everywhere you turn, there's guilt. Yeah,
everywhere there was guilt, anxiety. The anxiety became, in like the 4th month, very like a physical feeling of fear, like I'm being stalked by a serial killer and vampires at all times. And it was on a Monday that my parents came to visit. They lived on the other side. They lived over on the west side, like 45 minutes away. And they came to visit with my sister, and they visited for a while. And then we're going over to this art museum. And I had been planning for months to go because it seemed like a perfect outing, but I felt too overwhelmed. So I said, and as soon as they left, I was just crying, and I was standing on the front porch just with physical fear, sobbing, called them to come back, called my husband to come home. And I'd been telling them, my parents and my husband, a few times, like, I'm scared. And they'd always ask, of what? And I'd say, I don't know. And they'd tell me, then you have nothing to be scared of. But it felt like an extra limb had been like welded to me.
Right.
And I didn't know how to like amputate it. I'm like, it's stuck to me. I don't know how to get rid of this anxiety.
So then, if I may, like, note to providers and family members, if you hear a mom saying these things like they're scared, they don't know what's going on, ask more questions. Or, that's one of the signs. Like, if there's so few things that you are able to express, and it's so hard to even put into words what you're feeling, when you're feeling like you've just described, that when it does come out, when somebody finally is able to say something, it's really important to pay attention.
Yes. And I did finally, on that day where I was crying on the porch, my parents suggested we come stay with them.
Yeah.
So we did. And I put a lot of pressure on myself, though, like, oh, my husband's been displaced. He has a farther commute to work. I need to get better, like, right now.
Yeah.
I emailed friends and told them about the anxiety and insomnia. And I said, I think maybe I have postpartum depression. And one of my friends, who was the friend who was she's like the sort of person who could sit in a house that's on fire and finish a drink.
Okay.
So I tell her, and I'm expecting her to like email back and be like, you're overreacting. Don't worry. Don't be a hypochondriac. And she wrote back and said, oh, Courtney, I think you have postpartum depression. Go see a doctor. And if your doctor won't help, go see another and another until you get help.
Oh, great.
And that was just like, have another person say you have postpartum depression. I was able to pick up the phone, make an appointment with my obstetrician. And I went and I told, her everything. And I even told her about the dark thoughts. So she asked me to self-admit to the hospital, psychiatric wing. So I did that and stayed there for 4 nights.
How far along postpartum were you at that point?
I was just over 4 months at that point.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I had spent the past few nights at my parents'. So this was a Thursday. And, I guess a note for providers, I got put in this wing with people who I guess pose a danger to themselves. And there were people who were like schizophrenic, and like, I didn't major in psychology. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and I didn't know how to interact. And I had a roommate, and I was very scared. And the nurses there, I got a pump, but they made me pump in my room in front of my roommate.
Whoa.
Yeah. And then I told my psychiatrist after my first night there, like, I feel like I don't know how to interact with these patients. And he's like, what do you mean? Like, and he truly just didn't know. And I'm like, well, you have all your medical degrees and you do this every day. Of course, you know how to interact. But I really didn't know what I was supposed to be, like, how to exist there, and was horribly anxious. And, I then got bumped down to like a ward with just a few people, and it was just for depression. And, I think like they put me in that first ward because I said I'd had thoughts of hurting myself, but really I wasn't like planning my suicide. I didn't like the thoughts of hurting myself. It's just I had these thoughts, and my doctor never explained to me, like, well, that's the chemicals in your brain giving you these thoughts. That's not you. Mm-hmm. I wish he had he never explained. He told me, you have postpartum depression. And I told him, well, I'm very anxious. He's like, no, you're depressed. And I was. And he gave me Zoloft and Remeron. And the Zoloft kicked in after a couple of days. And then I could see I was depressed. But then I told him, he's like, oh, that's really convenient because you want me to discharge you. Now you're saying you're depressed. So.
Whoa.
Yeah, I'm writing, I'm almost done with my book about having postpartum depression, and I've had to leave out the stuff with my psychiatrist, and I'm just going to write a second book because I eventually broke up with him when I got pregnant with my son, Julian. Mm-hmm. There was just so much, like, he did really good things for me. He gave me the Zoloft, but from the beginning, he was very bad cop, good cop, mind games, saying I can't believe you when I'm saying, and I was in my most vulnerable state. And
it's terrible.
Oh yeah. I mean, at some point I started a support group that I can talk about more later, but he tried to hijack it, and he wanted me to run it through his office, and he was going to show up for a few minutes at the beginning, and then he could charge the insurance companies. I was like, but I want to do something for free, and I want it to be peer-to-peer. But he bullied me into wanting to do it at his office, always implying that my mental health was at stake. It was just... that deserves a whole separate book. Yes, it really does. And it really... He also, when he found out I was writing a book, was like, I want you to name me. I've had patients write books about me, with me, but they don't name me. And it sort of like robbed me of my inability to write about what he was doing to me.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I broke up with him that I was able to be like, okay, there's all these other layers to my story.
Right. Wow.
But yes, I was at the hospital 4 nights and then discharged against my doctor's great reluctance. But I really felt at that point like I hadn't seen my daughter in 4 days. And
they didn't allow visitors?
I think they would have, but Nathan, my husband, was staying with my parents, so that was like at least 45 minutes away.
Oh, uh-huh.
And I couldn't deal with the heartbreak of saying goodbye to her again and again.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, like, they took my iPhone away, which had all my photos of her on it. And, it was like, couldn't they have, like, just kept it in a locker and let me look at it every now and then?
Yeah.
It was a very, like, dehumanizing experience.
Wow. There are a lot of reasons why you telling your story is important, but, hopefully there are a mom who's listening and is having these experiences with their provider, or a provider who's listening and, is realizing that they don't know enough and go get some more training. These stories highlight where our system is broken and where we all need to be more compassionate and understanding. And how can you just deny somebody their feelings? Like, you're telling them what you were feeling, and they're like disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. And then I asked him after, at an early appointment, like, I'd like to understand more what's going on. Mm-hmm. And he Xeroxed something from like a clinical journal that was in all of this medical jargon. And, I couldn't understand it. But luckily I went and found, I'm going to butcher her name, Dr. Shoshana Bennett's book, Postpartum Depression for Dummies.
Yeah.
And that book was just, it did everything for me that my psychiatrist should have, but didn't. Mm-hmm. It explained everything, and it gave all of these great wellness tips. I always recommend that book to any moms that come to me. Like, just get
good for you. I like to assume that providers are doing their best and that they are trying to do what they think is in the best interest of their patients. And then sometimes also I think it's useful for them to admit that they don't know enough, or that if they don't know the answer, that they're willing to go in and get more resources. And, how beneficial would it have been for you so far along your path, so far from what we know of your story, to have somebody who knew what was going on?
Yeah, and who took the time, who wasn't afraid to be like, these are the symptoms, and, just to get information.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power.
Right. So you came out of the hospital and then you found a therapist?
Yeah, I had a cognitive behavioral therapist, a psychologist, and I had developed a lot of rituals during the anxiety and depression. And, my psychiatrist never came out and diagnosed me with OCD or postpartum anxiety, but like I know just from reading that that's what I had.
Uh-huh.
So I had stuff like unlocking and relocking the front and back doors like 20 times in a row. And then I'd do it again, in the middle of the night, checking Pippa's breathing, checking the burners on the stove, checking under the beds. I mean, I got so bad. I was, I wasn't just checking the closets. I was looking inside like the washing machine to make sure someone wasn't hiding in there. And my psychologist, worked me through unraveling all those rituals. And it ended up being great because he got me to the place I was before I had Pippa. And he was like, do you want to get better? And I was like, yeah. And we, kept working for a few more months. And I'm now like really a great master of anxiety. So it's the lemonade out of the lemons.
All right. So how long did that process take from the time you started to after the hospital to where you felt like you were feeling better or feeling more like yourself?
So I started in August and I ended the therapy in February. And before that, I felt a lot better. So it was like a whole month or two of me just kind of coming in and reporting how great I was doing and all the things I had done for myself that week. And then finally realizing like, okay, I really don't need to come in just to get high fives.
Right. Okay. I don't know how it feels to you, but like it sounds relatively short.
Yeah. And it was sort of like I kept getting better every month. And then I definitely would like kind of regress a little or have bad days and worry like, am I not even fully better? Yeah. I mean, I got better really quickly, but then every month after was like, wow, I'm even better. And I think it's also just part of becoming a mom and getting more confident and becoming more, immune to other people's judgment.
Ah, wow. Yeah. So you gained some really valuable skills then. The stuff you learned in therapy, just coping with your anxiety, but also this really, it happens for a lot of moms, maybe all moms, with this worry about judgment and the pressure that we put on ourselves. So you had a nice mix of all of that was really, really impacting you.
Yes. And, I'm actually grateful I had the whole adventure because I just learned so much about what makes me tick and what makes me, my best version of myself. So, we don't have time to like go into my whole life, but I think, I spent most of my life being anxious and now I'm not. And it's sort of like, being Dorothy and stepping out and pause and being like, oh, this is so much better.
That's so fantastic. I'm so happy for you, gosh, that, you are feeling better than you did before pregnancy and before postpartum.
Thank you.
And that's like, I think that can be like, a silver lining for the moms who are listening, who are struggling and having a hard time at finding the right type of support. You really can feel better than before because you're describing that there was some stuff going on already that contributed to how you were feeling postpartum. Plus there's like biology and, all that stuff, brain stuff and hormonal stuff. And it sounds like you had a really, really intense sleep deprivation that was contributing to stuff towards the end there.
Oh, yeah. The anxiety, just being in bed.
Yeah. And you've recovered.
And I recovered, full recovery, and I had my second baby, Julian, and he's 10 and a half months old now. And I got a new psychiatrist, and we sort of set up a plan. And she was really involved with, well, what do you want to do? And then she'd give me the options, and we'd talk it through. And my first psychiatrist just never asked for my input about how I was doing or how I wanted my treatment to go. So it was very empowering. And remember, I first saw her when I was pregnant and she didn't want to see me again for 3 months. And I had seen my first psychiatrist every month, which made me feel like there's something wrong with me. Like I need constant monitoring. And this other psychiatrist was like, no, you're doing great. Like, let's not rock the boat and we'll keep things the same, but call me if you need to. And we set up a plan and I made a self-care checklist with all the things I needed to be doing. So I could just, even when I'm brain dead, just realize, oh yeah, go outside and get fresh air. Go outside and walk around the block. And then I wrote a list of warning signs and red flags for my husband and parents. And, we decided, me and my psychiatrist, that I would just start Zoloft again right away. And I did a few days postpartum and I did great. And then at the 3-month mark, which is when the insomnia started with Pippa, the insomnia kind of clicked back on. And at first I was like, and I was more anxious. I was like, all right, well, let's just see what happens. Let's just ride it out. And after like 2 days, I was like, wait a second, I've seen this movie.
Oh,
I called my psychiatrist and she bumped up my Zoloft and put me, I was off the Remeron when I was pregnant and put me back on that. And like a light switch, I was doing great. And so I'm still doing all that and I'm in remission, and we're going to start weaning me like in the new year after the holidays.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like you've become an advocate too. I mean, there's nothing quite like a really difficult postpartum depression and anxiety to, after you heal from it, to put you into action. And that sounds like what you've done.
Oh yeah. It's become, I feel like I was always missing a calling, and my calling now, and it just keeps getting better and better. And
I feel you on that one. I can totally identify with that too. So there's a couple of things I want to touch on too, is that out of your pain and what you've been through, you are an advocate. And now you've started a podcast called Adventures with Postpartum Depression. You have a book that's coming out with the same name, and you have a support group in your area. And these are just like so amazing.
And they feel so easy now that I'm doing them. And they were so overwhelming before I started. And now it's like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. And it's needed. All of the stuff you're doing is needed. Like we were kind of chatting beforehand, it takes all voices from wherever, whatever your platform is, speak. And you are totally doing that.
Yeah, I started first with the book, and that was very cathartic. I recommend writing to anyone struggling with postpartum depression or just even motherhood. Like journaling is just such a great way to touch base with yourself. And I'm going to self-publish. I just hired an editor because I don't want to deal with the publishers, and that takes a couple of years. I just want to get my story out there and be able to control the price and give it, for free to people who need it for free. I don't need a publisher controlling that. And that inspired me to create the support group, because I really started my healing when I was able to start telling moms. Like I took this mommy class in Pasadena, and when I first told all the moms when I was like 9 months postpartum, it just like one of the moms afterwards was like, wow, you made yourself so vulnerable. And I realized, I was like, no, I was vulnerable before because I was so worried about what everyone was thinking. And once I said it, I realized I was like, it did not matter. And I was invulnerable to what everyone thought.
That's amazing. I'm like happy dancing, clapping over here for you. That's so cool.
And that's why I started a support group, just to create for moms to talk. And I actually, it's a long story, but my first psychiatrist tried to hijack it. And so I ended up not doing it for a while because I needed to do my own healing from an abusive relationship. And I went into therapy with a female new therapist who I adore. So I restarted it a few months ago. And at first, not many people were coming. And I felt like, gosh, I want to help more people. And I know people just can't get out of the house sometimes. Like when you're depressed, it's hard enough with a newborn. And I just felt like I had to do a podcast. And, the universe is funny how we just both started like right around the same time.
Right.
We're practically neighbors. And it was like, we need this. We need these stories out there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think we started within a week of each other, our podcast. And you have a group and I have a group out here, and we both participated in the Climb Out of Darkness with Postpartum Progress. There's a lot of parallels here.
Yeah. And I'm going to the Warrior Mom Conference in October.
No way. Cool. That should be awesome.
Yes.
That's going to be amazing. Yeah. And that's a great organization. Did you use that Postpartum Progress as part of your support, or what organizations did you lean on?
I didn't find any organizations until after I found Postpartum Progress when I was a little over a year postpartum, because I just felt this urge to help and spread the word. I didn't know how. And I thought, well, there must be a 5K or something. Right. And I finally found the Climb Out of Darkness, and I did a solo climb, and then I joined the LA climbs. And that's how I found Postpartum Progress. And I didn't really get as involved with Postpartum Progress until after I had Julian. I had a couple of months postpartum where I kind of felt like I need to just be me, and I can't be feeding off anyone else's issues.
Yeah.
And then I just sort of emerged from those, first 3 months, and I was like, okay, I'm ready. And I signed up for the conference, and I got onto all these Facebook groups, and now I feel, it's just better than ever being like linked into that community.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, thank you. I have so much to share, and you are sharing it through your podcast and your book that's coming up. Please do let me know when that's out, and I will help spread the word about that. And your support group is in Pasadena?
Yes, it's technically San Marino, but basically Pasadena, at the family room on Thursdays from we say 2 to 3, but we're often there 3:30 or 4.
Oh, it's one of those.
It's free and you come whenever you want. And if you don't come for 3 months and then you come back, no judgment.
That's awesome. So for you guys who are listening, you can find Courtney on Instagram and at Courtney Novak, and on Facebook. Also, you have PPD Adventure. Is that right?
PPD Adventures.
Awesome. PPD Adventures on Facebook. So whoever's listening, and if you want to be in contact with Courtney, you can find her there. And I just really appreciate you, Courtney, for doing the work that you're doing and sharing your story. And I really firmly believe that in order for other people to see, we have to be seen. And you are showing up so that other moms can know that they're going to be okay too. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
By joining us today and listening, you're a part of the growing community of people who are aware and concerned for mothers and families during this beautiful and sometimes very difficult time of life. Please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review this free podcast so that Mom and Mind can be found by moms, families, and providers who will benefit from hearing our talks. If you or someone you know is having a hard time, help is available. Please look for resources for help at momandmind.com, where you will also find links and information from today's episode. Thank you for listening and being a part of the Mom and Mind community.